That was lovely.
You loved it, right?
Very well done, very well edited. And to see Kushwant Singh and me, that must have been 100 years ago. But always a pleasure because we worked so well together. We collaborated on an anthology.
Okay.
So this brought back great memories. Thank you. Whoever put it together, fantastic. Well done.
Well, only one thing that before Manju you begin, I'd like to ask is, when I dug deep into getting to know more about you, there's one thing that I read that you first, right at the beginning, started your journey as a model, and then into journalism. I want to know how that switch happened, please, even before Manju takes over.
The two aren't mutually exclusive, to start with. And when you're a very young person, you don't have a degree in hand, you're staying with your parents, your independence matters a lot to you, and you are spotted when you're with your father. My father was a senior bureaucrat in the Ministry of Law, so we'd get invited to a lot of wonderful functions and occasions when there were VVIPs coming through Mumbai, and the governors at homes and so on. And at one such, I was approached by someone who asked me whether I'd like to give modeling a shot. And without, of course, asking my father, I said, definitely, no, without knowing what it meant. Really speaking, what I was committing to, I only knew it would mean I'd be doing something which I have agency over, my own decision. Okay. And at that time, I was a national athlete. I was representing the state. I had records in 100 meters and all of that. So I was a jock. Okay. Modeling was nowhere in my imagination.
But your physical appearance was like that because of sports.
Well, that's for others to say. I just felt I was better at playing hockey than I could ever be on the ramp. But I managed to play hockey and be on the ramp for 5 years. And that was a very good 5 years, actually, because I had a lot of resistance from my parents and from home. Coming from a Maharashtrian middle-class background, no one in our family had ever thought of getting into modeling. I'm glad I did, because it gave me such a sense of self. I got to travel a lot, meet the most incredible people, and understand actually the value of earning your own money. Mm-hmm. It was a lesson that I've tried to pass on to my daughters, because there's no such thing as an independent mind for a woman unless she has an income to match. Otherwise, it remains, in theory, an independent mind, but the agency is never with you. So what started back then, I must have been 16 or 17, continues till today. I'm 77, and I still earn my own money, and I feel so good about that.
And what about the switch? When did you decide to
take it from here? Thank you.
That's easy enough, the switch, but
Sorry.
I'll just finish what she asked me, because it's a bit unfair to Manju.
Yes, it is. I'm so sorry, Manju.
But that's okay. It's an interesting question. So I'll quickly tell you. I was modeling for 5 years. I'd done all the every conceivable campaign as a ramp model as well as a face model. Like I was a Pond's girl for 5 years and Bombay Dyeing in all the wonderful campaigns that there were at the time. And I was frankly restless and bored, because there's just so much fun you can have just looking at your own pictures in a newspaper. I wanted to see a byline instead. Okay. And I got that chance also very wonderfully. I went in for a job as a copywriter, and I was told, yes, you can start as a copywriter provided you give up modeling, because we need a full-time copywriter.
Oh, okay.
That's the interesting story, because that person asked me, Nari Hira, the editor of Stardust, the publisher of Stardust, I was the founder editor. He asked me, how much are you earning as a model? At that time, I was earning maybe 25,000, which was a lot of money.
Of course.
And he said, if you want to work here, I'm going to start you on 350 rupees a month. And I said yes. And I gave up just like that. Okay. And I started working with him. There was no looking back. I loved what I did. I loved writing and the many opportunities that came my way. I loved every moment. And here I am, more than 50 years later, 53 years and counting. I've never ever skipped a deadline because I think deadlines are sacred. So if someone entrusts you with a column and a deadline, you don't make excuses saying, I'm having a fight with my husband or I'm having a bad hair day. You just sit down there and you go ahead and you do what you're committed to doing.
Thank you for sharing that, and over to you, Manju.
Yes. So,
By the way, you still look like a diva.
so at 17, you were in the cover of Femina, if I'm not wrong.
That's
17
right. Yeah.
years
17,
old.
yes.
And also the fact that you were also into art and painting, and you had a tiff with your father. Your father wasn't keen for you to take up art because your art was very expressive. So tell us about that.
You've done your research very well, I must say. Yes, first of all, they disapproved of my being a cover girl. I did multiple covers for Femina and Eve's Weekly and all the magazines, but that very first cover upset them no end because I was shot by the then Jitendra Arya, who was the head photographer for the entire Times of India group. And I was wearing a paper shirt, not just a shirt, but I was wearing, obviously, trousers below that, but it was made out of Chimanlal handmade paper.
Okay.
And my parents thought it was ridiculous that their daughter could be A, on the cover of a magazine, B, wearing a shirt made out of handmade paper. And then came the worst blow for my parents, because in those days, Femina carried a little blurb asking the cover person what the person's ambitions were.
Okay.
And most of the ladies of my generation, and of course the men, that was taken for granted, but women in particular, just coming into our own, it was the early, whatever the period was, they would say, I want to become an engineer, I want to become a doctor, I want to become a pilot, I want to become a lawyer, or not even a chartered accountant. Yeah, these were the professions. That's it. And I said, well, I want to get married and have many children. And my father, when he read that, that upset him even more than the paper shirt. He said, what kind of an ambition is that? Because my siblings were all high achievers, gold medalists, ophthalmic surgeon, lawyer. My brother was one of the first graduates from IIT Kharagpur. And I was the youngest. And he said, do you even call that an ambition? I mean, any illiterate person can marry and have children. And I stuck to what I said, even with him. I said, no, I mean, everything else will be icing on the cake. But this is what I want. And I can say now with,
And it
six children and 7 grandchildren, that my ambition was certainly met. I don't know about his.
Yeah.
You have to know what means something to you. And that was always what I wanted, a strong and large family.
Right.
So it may have sounded to him something very frivolous, but it didn't matter because that still matters to me.
And you have this image of yours which is unflappable outside, where people look at you and you're powerful. There is something about you which reeks of power. At the same time, I want to ask you this question.
What does power even mean? I mean, unless you're talking to a politician or there's
No.
Narendra Modi you're
No.
interviewing, what does power mean? It just means knowing yourself. And to me, actual power, if you ask me, it's a word I don't like. I find a lot of negative connotations attached to it. It also implies ego and a sense of you have something over someone else who's less powerful. But I don't see it like that. I think for me, the real power is the power of choice. And a lot of women are denied that power for various reasons. And the power of choice is something so supreme, and no one can take that away from you, no matter whether you're educated, not educated, young, old, man, woman. The power to say no to something that you don't wish to do, to be in a situation where no one can push you around, that you can walk away from something that you are not willing to be a part of. Right. That to me defines power. So if you're calling me power, thank you.
Yes.
I hope I've lived that.
Yes.
I
Also,
certainly
it
have
also
tried.
meant the power of the written word, which defines your life. And the fact that you see the power of the written word still as powerful today in the world of social media.
That kind of power you should be talking to a Delhi journalist, not to someone who lives in Mumbai, and not to someone who has never cared about even finding out what that power means. To me, it means complete and total independence. It means not having to take calls from anybody. It means speaking truth to power, which is totally different. And that I think I've done that with a sense of commitment and with a certain amount of success for over 5 decades. The power of the written word, the much bigger question that you asked me, whether today it's equally relevant, whether there can be opinion shapers, opinion makers who can make a government rise, fall, make a politician accountable. Well, you know, we had Arun Shourie in my time. I don't see an Arun Shourie right now in our midst. And also today, the power has shifted. Even the power of the written word has shifted. Every single person in this room has the power because of the internet. You can have your own blog, you can express your own opinion, you can be a citizen journalist, you can be a vigilante, and most of the revolutions that have taken place in the recent times in the world have not been driven by the power of a journalist or a politician. It's been the power of the people. Right. And that is true power. When the people feel emboldened enough to reject something that they abhor and can make that happen and make the change happen for their country and for co-citizens, that is true power, and that the people have today. So in that sense, the internet is a great equalizer. I think it democratizes everything. And opinions that are shared today don't necessarily come from, the big gods and demigods and media gods. I don't think so at all. It comes from just someone saying something which triggers a kind of domino effect across the world or in a country or in a community.
Right. And that's why the power of the digital world today, because you're on social media as well. And how do you see that impact today when you've moved into that space of social media from print? Because media itself has has changed. And newspapers, reading, magazines have completely declined to another space. So how do you see the change? Do you celebrate it? Do you look back and look back at it wistfully? How is somebody who's always been at the fore of magazines and print look back at this change, and how do you feel?
I am very compatible with change across everything, because change is dynamism, change is progress. Nothing in the world is static and should not be. So I like movement. I like movement of thinking. I like movement of political thought, of philosophy, of art. I like the idea of, that's part of evolution. You can't freeze any moment. This has been a very radical change. Right now, people are extremely scared of AI. I'm not scared of AI at all, because at the end of the day, for a writer like myself, people feel so threatened, whether they're in the movie business or as filmmakers or poets or artists, or they just feel they're going to be replaced by AI or their personalities being cloned. None of that should be scary to us at all, because at the end of the day, AI can only process information that's fed into it. That information is still in our control. We feed the information. AI does not have imagination. We do. Imagination cannot be fed into a machine.
Right.
It's intuitive. It's something that is it's a gift.
Yes.
And human beings have it. I'm sure there are people who have it in the animal kingdom that we don't know about. That's how they have survived. We don't know enough about other species. But communication itself is something we imagine that only human beings have mastered. That is not so. There are unknown aspects of life which still remain a mystery. And it's the mysteries of life that make life itself so challenging. And AI is just one step forward in a technologically evolving universe. Right. So AI cannot still reproduce life. At least I don't see that happening in my lifetime. Right. So we should make our peace with it. You know, it's like when television first came on the scene. I remember it so well, and everyone said, "Oh, that's the end of movies." No, you make your peace and you live compatibly with new technology, new ideas, new innovations. Because without that, you'll be leading a very dull life. So there's nothing to fear from new media, from social media. I like to think, since you asked me about myself and my presence on social media, I'm as active as I wish to be. Social media is not on top of me. I'm on top of social media.
Right.
I share what I want to share. And it's not as if I'm dictated to by social media, nor do I follow algorithms or anything that's being, the prompts that come to you. I do not fall for it. I have fun with it, and which is what it should be. I do not respond to trolls because I do not respond to anonymous nobodies, faceless people without names or faces. And I receive what I'm sure every person, particularly women, we are more vulnerable to those kind of rape threats and
Yes.
death threats, and I'll do this to your family, I'll do this to you, I'll harm your children, I'll kidnap your grandchildren. I've lived with all of that for more than 30 years. And I've had death threats, I've had morchas coming to my house. That's part of one's life. It's a life I've picked for myself, so I'm not cribbing.
But that's also a lot of courage there. I mean, what people coming to your doorstep. And I believe there's I remember one instance where you actually went and met them, the people who wanted to come and beat you up.
Yes, because I believe people are sent by political parties to threaten you, come to your doorstep and yell slogans and hurl stones, are essentially paid goons. They are cowards. They don't even know whose home they're coming to. They're just told, go to this address and call out that person's name and throw a few stones, threaten that person, blacken her face. Well, this lot had come to actually gag me, which they had announced to the press, that watch while we gag her. So now I had a lot of police in my home, and they said, no, madam, you can't go down. आप ऐसे कैसे बोल रहे हैं? Don't you go to the balcony? वो आपको कुछ भी कर सकते हैं. They'll throw stones and so on. I said, these guys, you're scared of these guys? They said, आप समझते नहीं हैं. They are very dangerous people. I said, well, I'm going down. आपको नहीं आना है तो आप यहीं रहिए. So they very reluctantly, I must say, accompanied me downstairs.
But you also mentioned the vada pav there. Please mention.
Yes, exactly. So at the end of it all, I asked these guys, what is your problem? Why are you here? If you could tell me, let's talk. So they looked at each other and they asked, why are we here? More or less in Marathi. Because they actually didn't know why they were there. They were sent by a political party to intimidate. They were paid to just come there and have some tamasha happen on television. They looked like such fools. Then the police people didn't know what to do with them. So then they said, now what should we do? I said, that's your job. Do what you want. I said, I don't care. So they said, acha. So they, picked up 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 of them and put them into the police van and took them to the police station and let them go. But this is not the only instance.
Right.
It's happened many times. That if there is, for example, that is if you guys are not getting bored with these stories, we can switch to something else. But I'll just finish this one. There was a book launch of Chidambaram's which Shekhar Gupta, editor of Indian Express, had asked me to come and be in conversation with our finance minister at the time. And again, these political parties, of course it's published that we'll be at a bookstore and we'll be coming at this time. And they're assembled there. And, if you have established a good rapport with media colleagues, even very junior colleagues, over a long career in media, media is, at the end of it all, it's a community. So a lot of these young girls from, I think it was Zee TV, called me and said, if you come, they're waiting to blacken your face. I said, who? So they said, they've sent us this thing that come here, we're waiting for her to show up, and we're going to disrupt this particular launch. So at first, I didn't want that bookstore to be destroyed and so on. So I called up Shekhar. He said, no, nothing of the kind. There's no one here. So someone's just misleading you. I said, are you sure, Shekhar? He said, yes, I'm absolutely sure. We have our own security because Chidambaram is here and so on. I said, okay, in that case, I'm on my way. I was 15 minutes away from the venue when he called back and he said, turn around from wherever you are and don't go back to your home. It's a very angry mob. So just don't go home. And I went to my son's home and I said, but what was all that about? One doesn't know where, sometimes where these things come from. You never know. I was charged with sedition and treason. The trial was to begin in Bhagalpur. I was in an advanced stage of pregnancy. My husband and I had, there was no airport close by, or we were booking our tickets for the trial to begin, train tickets. And as luck would have it, that government fell. And with that, the charges were dropped. And I didn't have to undergo whatever I would have had to undergo at that point. So, there are things. It was the Simranjit Singh Maan case, where I was accused number 3 or something of that kind. It was ridiculous. The whole thing was so exaggerated and so unnecessary. I mean, what they were charging me and other people with, I'm not going into the politics of that, but you have to be able to stand up for yourself. You have to be able to say, this is what I'm here to defend. I have enough faith in the judiciary and I'll fight it all the way. And I did, even with these guys who came to my home, 400 strong, I moved the Supreme Court. But the point is, I could move the Supreme Court. I had the means to do it. What about people who don't have the means? Then they just have to suffer because the state is always much bigger than any citizen and can exert that kind of power on citizens. So either you feel strongly enough to put yourself there or out on the line and say, I will fight this, and I could and I did, and I won, but a lot of people can't. So one has to think about all of them too. It's not just about me. It's about every citizen in this room as well, who may be unfairly charged at some stage, and then what do you do? It's important to know what your plan is, because often there's no plan B.
Right. Wow. Okay. You've had your writing has been very strong in terms of also criticizing a lot of actors in the Hindi film industry. And there were times then people have visited your home and sat for an hour without just consuming water. And do you want to talk about that incident? Because the star that we're talking about is none other than Amitabh Bachchan. So we want to know what happened that day.
Well, it's all ended wonderfully well. Do you really want me to tell you about it? Because it was at a time when Amitabh Bachchan was not popular with the film press at all. It was during, for a lot of young people here, this is like history they wouldn't probably be aware of. But for those of you who may know about it, we had a terrible period in India called the emergency. You may have watched Kangana Ranaut's film on it to know what that was like to have lived through. I don't know what she's projected in a film, but I know what I lived through. At that time, it was believed that Mr. Bachchan was somehow very pro-government, very close to the Gandhis, and he had made them somehow exert enough pressure to make the film press also come under the draconian laws that the emergency had imposed on media. Rightly, wrongly, fairly, unfairly, it was believed that it was because of him that we were being harassed in the manner that we were. We really couldn't write anything at all other than saying Asha Parekh has got new poodles in her home, or someone is using a new brand of shampoo or something like that. So it was decided collectively, not by me alone, that Mr. Bachchan would be banned from any reference at all in the film press. And that's when we started calling him all, Mr. Lambuji, or angry young man, or angry middle-aged man. By then he was older. But we never mentioned him by name. We didn't cover his movies. We didn't cover any of his public events. And he was just invisible from the film press for a long time. He must have figured that, it's ridiculous. You can't, an actor needs, it's oxygen for an actor to be in the public eye, to be written about, photographed. He must have thought it's time to make peace. So he came over, and yes, for the first couple of hours he sat. He is quite a reticent, silent man. So we sat there quite silently, and he didn't want to have chai, coffee, water, nothing. It was a bit awkward. And we were leaving. I think we were traveling the whole family that night, so there was nothing in the kitchen that I could really offer him. There was no Swiggy in those days. And I thought he'd just come there for half an hour, but it was 4 hours later, and I was hungry. So then I think
And there was no conversation before.
very little, but no reference specifically to this.
So he didn't address the elephant.
He did not address the elephant in the room, and I wasn't about to drag an elephant into the room. I had no reason to. I had not invited him to. So it was really, the call was his, whether he wanted to bring it up or he didn't. And he didn't, and as a courtesy to a guest, particularly since my husband and he knew each other so well in their Kolkata days, when Amitabh was a junior executive in the same company, or so their relationship was more important when he's coming as a mehman to our house. So why should I bring up something unpleasant if he's not going to? But it was kind of tacitly understood, he's an intelligent man, that the war was technically over. We had signed a ceasefire, though we hadn't signed anything. So it worked fine.
But it was never addressed. So
It was never addressed, no. So we continue to meet. He's launched my books.
Yes,
I've attended his functions. I've attended his Diwali parties. He's attended our home. He's come, to my husband's birthdays. But that remains a sort of unspoken, little tacit, little pact between us, never to be talked about.
Right. Another beautiful story is about the cover of Starry Nights. MF Hussain, was it Starry Nights? The cover that he came running with the paint still wet on the cover, if I'm not wrong. So tell us about that.
But we were really, my husband and I were very lucky to have MF Hussain as a neighbor. He lived just down the road. But apart from anything, I personally had a very, very wonderful, inspiring, and phenomenal rapport with him. And I miss him still a lot. His mind, his creativity, his imagination, his way of looking at life, the simplest things in life, the way he saw it. I mean, my entire approach to aesthetics were so strongly influenced by Hussain Saab. So when I asked him to do the cover, and it's like asking Picasso to do a cover for a novel that Hussain Saab had not even read at that time. And he asked me to kind of describe what the book was about, and I told him that it's a kind of bold, risque, pretty out there novel with a lot of language that's colorful. And he said, Bas, I don't want to know anything else. So he drew that particular image, which is a beautiful, gorgeous image of a semi-clad lady. And he placed a hibiscus kind of strategically in that image, just below her navel. And he said, I hope, we are all adults in this room, right?
Yeah.
No, there is a 12-year-old. She's not there?
I could.
Okay.
No.
Well, nothing objectionable what I'm saying. He said, if the lady in your novel is being deflowered, then this is the most appropriate cover because the hibiscus says it all. Which is his way of interpreting something. There was nothing that I found objectionable. The publishers thought it's a great cover, and we just went with that cover.
And the book too. It's a rumored, often spoken about love affair between two big Bollywood stars that we know about. Was it loosely based on them at all?
The two who shall be nameless by you?
No, I'll be happy to name them. It's Amitabh
Name
Bachchan
them.
Rekha love affair is explored. I think inspired. I don't know. I don't know the right words to say it. But as a lot of it is reflected like that. So is it true?
Well, it was assumed that it was about Rekha and Amitabh Bachchan, and the love story, which may or may not actually exist, or it may be all in her head or her fantasy, whatever. But that's a love story that continues to intrigue even this generation of readers and fans. And she always, but always makes sure to feed into that collective fantasy of people who imagine that there was something, there is something, there could be something, but that's her prerogative. What I want to say is the story of a South Indian, a nubile, beautiful South Indian actress coming to Mumbai and falling madly in love with a married Punjabi hero is not restricted to Rekha.
Right.
There was Vaijantimala before her, there was Hema Malini, there's Jaya Prada. I mean, a lot of these girls, there is a kind of, the dynamic is something
Of the North and the
so,
South,
so,
you
the
mentioned.
North-South thing. And I kind of get it, what that could be, the attraction between two, sort of, the polarity is so powerful and yet so irresistible. So if people assumed it was her, there's a lot of commonality, like I said, between all their stories. They're very, very similar.
Similar to each
Similar. But in Sri Devi, for example, Boni, I can name at least 5
Yes.
top girl actresses from the South who got involved with married men from Bollywood who happened to be Punjabis. Raj Babbar, no, Smita was Maharashtrian, not South Indian. So the story in that sense is generic, but if people choose to think it's her, well, why not her?
Also, so about 25 years, 30 years ago, you spoke about Socialite Evenings when it was released, and it spoke about boredom in a marriage. And it talks about how boredom becomes a reason for a woman to step out of a marriage, which was at that point of time was considered odd, but today quite normalized.
It wasn't considered odd. It was considered subversive and dangerous to society. That's what I was told. That you're putting thoughts into the heads of our Bharatiya Naris. You're telling them that they have no right to be bored. They cannot be bored in a marriage. That's not a reason to leave a marriage. So I used to ask them, because at a lot of the book readings, a lot of men used to be really angry because maybe they knew how bored their own wives were and were afraid that their wives would read this book and run out of the house. So they would challenge it all the time and say that how can you put such wicked ideas into the heads of women? And I've always told them that, those ideas don't have to be put into anyone's head. They exist. You don't want to acknowledge them. That's up to you. Maybe your wife doesn't articulate what she's feeling. That's also between the two of you. But I have not invented this concept of a bored wife. A bored wife has existed through centuries. I'm sure Draupadi was bored too. She had 5 husbands, but who knows whether they engaged her emotionally or physically or in any form. Or even the great Russian masters often wrote about Anna Karenina. So many of the great books. Simone de Beauvoir wrote about it frequently. Later, the feminists wrote about it differently, of course, because they wrote about it with a kind of subtext which was more political. But here, it was considered really something very outrageous, because the men would come and tell me, alag baat hai, if the man is a drunkard, if he beats her, then she's justified. Boredom, is that a reason? I said, it's as big a reason. Because beating, alcoholism, that society can see. But a man who is indifferent to the woman he's married to, not interested in her on any level, like we saw in the recent movie, which she's so wonderful, Sania Malhotra in Mrs.
Yeah.
And there's something to be understood in not just our society, it's a very universal global phenomenon where a woman's existence is seen within certain very specified duties, boundaries, roles demarcated for her. And if she steps a little outside of that, she's considered somehow a dangerous agent out to disrupt society. I mean, a woman with a mind of her own is very dangerous to society, according to a lot of threatened and insecure people. It shouldn't be that way, because at the end of it all, marriage should be something very beautiful and equal. And equality gives it beauty.
Right.
Mutual respect gives it beauty. So it's not rocket science that you need to explain to anyone, not to a woman, not to a man. It's something that we should be able to take for granted. But often I think women come with the kind of baggage, perhaps from their own parental home, where they may tell you that it's what you've signed up for. Basically, it's what you signed up for. So there's no out in this one. Things are changing, but it's still very hard, not just for women, but equally for men, who are also, the dynamics of our society are changing so rapidly that for men to get used to a new matrix of relationships, marriage, what it entails to be in a relationship of equality, shared responsibility, is going to take a generation, I think, for that change to be felt more strongly in our society. But I feel completely optimistic and hopeful. At the end of it all, I believe every human being wants just one thing, whether within marriage or outside marriage, with your kids, your family, your friends. You want to be in a happy place. It's something so basic. So to work towards that happy space is the challenge.
Lovely. Also, a lot of your characters all don't start being empowered. They grow through their narratives. So when you were writing them, were you already sure of the track they would be taking, or they led you to the narrative? Did you map them, or they?
I don't map my characters. It sounds almost crazy to say this, but it's absolutely 100% accurate and truthful. The characters have to appear to me. How they appear is also strange. Sometimes I hear the voice of the character. It's always a woman, because all my protagonists have been women. And I've never ever seen women, I don't want to see women as victims. So none of the ladies in my books are victims, even if the book starts off with them being in a situation where they are victimized. So that much that's the one premise I'm completely sure about, that they are not going to be walked all over. They are not doormats. Other than that, to flesh out that character, that person has to appear to me. It could be something very simple. One of my books, I remember, and that lady happens to be a good friend now. I didn't know her then. She was the daughter of a friend of mine. And I just watched her. I didn't know who she was. I was standing in the lobby of a hotel, and I watched her emerge from a low-slung car, looking just incredible. Incredible not because she's startlingly beautiful or was wearing the most amazing clothes. I think it was her personality and it was her body language. It was a lady no one would want to mess with. And she was in her 20s at the time. I didn't know who she was when she got out of that car. I found out later. And it was such a powerful image. It didn't leave me. And I started to build a whole narrative around her persona, trying to imagine what her life was like. And as it turned out, when I later did find out who she was, my imagination and her life overlapped quite a bit.
So you could see what
I could see it.
Her backstory.
So it was wonderful to discover that. But it was intuitive. It was nothing that I had prepped myself for. Similarly, one of my books, I think it was written during the COVID period. I'd finished it during the pandemic. That lady, the book is called Srila Ji. Now, Srila Ji is a character who I personally like very much. The timing of the book was such that people were not ready to they were just about coming out of something that was cataclysmic for the whole world. And sometimes books also have their own kismat. They have a destiny. Depends on their timing. Sometimes they do well, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they suddenly start doing well again after a gap of a few years. I hope that happens with Srila Ji because she's an interesting character. And she, actually, I heard her voice when I was under a shower. I said, this is crazy. And she was just there. Not there, but I could hear her. And she was saying, come on, write about me. You know, and I came out and I said, wow, I mean, I like this woman. I like this woman. And then subsequently, she stayed with me. Even her name stayed with me. I came out and I wrote the name Srila. Srila. I didn't write G because that became the title of the book. Srila, I like the name. And I wrote it down and I said, I should write something around Srila. And subsequently, I met a lady. Her name was not Srila. But she fit that mold.
Wow.
I had already seen that person.
This is uncanny.
Uncanny. That lady still doesn't know it's her. And we still meet because it's a story of a very unconventional person taking very unconventional, decisions and making a life for herself in a very, very restricted, very domineering, conservative Marwari family. But this lady is anything but a suppressed and depressed and repressed Marwadi lady. She is Srila Ji. And I really enjoyed writing that character. I think every character is different, how they come to you.
Can you tell us a little more about this character for people to pick up the book and read it?
Oh, I don't know if Srila Ji is available at the festival, I'm not sure. They'd asked me for a few titles. I gave them some of the safer titles because I thought it's young students. And I don't want to be accused of corrupting their minds and leading to depravity in society. These days, everybody seems to be, even comedians and people who are making unguarded comments on podcasts are being accused of depraving public imagination and minds.
Yes.
So I've given some safe titles. I don't know if Srila Ji is one of them.
Okay. Interesting you say that because you've been a topic of research in a lot of universities across the world. And I, for once, can vouch for it because when I was in my master's, this was going to be my introduction, but I think I'm going to weave this in the conversation. So in my master's, I had read a paper on Shobha De's novels as popular literature. And from Baroda, where I was studying, I had to go to Pune for the presentation. And the conversation happened. So I read the paper out in a canteen. So the setting was a canteen where three friends are talking about Shobha De and her work, and she walks in. So it was an imagination of Shobha De walking into a conversation. And it was lovely. People came up and spoke about it to me personally. And this was all handwritten. We're talking about that era, not even the computers. So people come and talk to me about it. And it was a competition. And I didn't win it, though people came and liked it. Because one professor comes up to me and tells me, there is politics in choosing a topic. But it didn't matter because she's unflappable. She's read all over the world. And she has doctorates on you. How many doctorates on your kind of literature?
Well, I'm told more than 250 dissertations across the world, but I keep saying it with I don't know, I'm kind of detached from it because when I read those presentations, and some of them are very kind, they send it to me as bound dissertations, I can't connect to any of it, it's too academic. I keep asking myself, did I really mean to say this? Was this what I intended? Are they reading it right? But then at the end of it all, it's also a great learning, and it makes you feel in so many ways so grateful that someone could spend 2, 3, 4 years. I have people from universities across Maharashtra, for example, who come to meet me with the dissertation for, as they call it, the blessing, which is so wonderful. And they come with the traditional way of showing respect to an older person. They come with a coconut, and they come with haldi kumkum, they come with shawls, they come with like you gave me this beautiful, today, the fulkari. and they speak to me in Marathi, and my reality is so far from their reality, and that they have taken so much time off their lives with such commitment, such dedication, such seriousness to study the characters in my books. And across the world, there are, the books are translated into 14, 15, 16, whatever languages. So I have young scholars coming to me when I'm traveling or doing readings. And it's a great feeling, but I don't know. I don't know how to feel. I don't know what to feel. I just feel shy most of the time and try and change the topic because it just, I don't know. Academia is something I'm so overawed by, so awestruck by. And as I told you earlier when we were chatting over chaat, the best chaat, better than the Amritsari chaat, is in Chandigarh. And I was telling her that many, many years ago, the University of Chandigarh had invited me to a conference, and I'd come with my husband. And it was wonderfully engaging 2 or 3 hours that I spent here. And I said to you and to a few of your colleagues that my husband remembers it to this day as one of the most scintillating and the most stimulating for both of us and the most informed interactions we've had anywhere in the world. It was in Chandigarh and at the university. Because the people in the audience were truly engaged. They had read my work. The questions that came from a very good place. They wanted to know. They were curious. They were academic, but they were serious about. They were not there for time pass, as they say in Mumbai.
Right. This is one question I always wanted to ask you. You've written about the mothers of former Miss India as well, the way they have been in public eye. You've written about actors, stars. Now, when you actually meet them after an article that you've done, which is not very flattering to them, what is the interaction like? Is it uneasy? Is it normal? Is it, how is it?
It's not uneasy for me.
Yeah.
So if it makes them uncomfortable, there's nothing I can do about that. Because it's written with full, complete, what shall I say, truthfulness from my side. Mm-hmm. A lot is written about me which is terrible. I don't go confront people and say, oh, how could you think that about me? Well, they've thought that about me, so it's okay, deal with it.
Yes,
it goes with the territory. Yeah. You can't be thin-skinned if you're a public figure and say, oh, aise kyun likha aapne? Abhi likh liya hai na, so it's over, finished. But I had that happen actually with the beautiful, gorgeous and enormously talented Kalki, who I admire. As a person, as a writer, and as an actor. I didn't care for her Yellow Boots, the very first film, because I didn't care for her then husband. I didn't like, I thought it was a pretentious film. I didn't like it, but I'm entitled not to like it as an audience person. And I think I must have written somewhere that I didn't like the movie. And she was young and she was touchy and sensitive. So I met her somewhere at a social place, and I went up to her and, we were introduced, and I spoke to her normally, naturally. She's younger than my children. And she was she said, oh, you didn't write something very nice about me, or you didn't like my work, or you didn't like my movie. And I said, yes, I probably did write that. I'd forgotten, I write so much, I couldn't remember it. I said, which movie? Was it Yellow Boots? She said, yes. I said, yeah. I saw it again and I still don't like it. I'm so sorry, but you've done a lot of movies since then which I've admired and loved, and you've grown great as an actor. So that was it. It ended just like that. I had dinner with her last night. We could laugh about it. That's a mature way of dealing with criticism. You cannot hang on to something someone has said about you and say, I got the worst reviews any writer in the subcontinent has received when my first book came out. Reuters did a story of the record number of bad reviews any writer has ever received. Wow. I don't you know or care who wrote them? I'm not going to hang on to that. I went on and wrote 25 more books. That's how you deal with. You take some of it, you pay attention to what's valid, and then you move on, because what you want to do with your life and the opportunities that you're getting as a writer are far bigger than what people are saying about you.
Right.
So, anyone who's doing anything that's shared in the public space has to know that there are going to be brickbats. And there's going to be praise, and there's going to be love. So you take from it what you want to. And if you look at it positively, very often, if the criticism comes from a good source, any writer, any creative person will definitely pay attention to what's being written and what's being said, and say, well, yes, maybe, I was so totally off in that, and maybe I need to pay more attention to whatever that criticism was about. But to end this on a funny note, because I see humor in almost everything. I can see humor. I just live with, I think, a healthy sense of humor about myself to start with, and I can get a big laugh out of me. Now we're being told how many minutes more? वहाँ पे दिखा रहे हैं 5?
Okay, 5 minutes.
Okay. So I'll just end it with a story about criticism, which is really quite funny. So at that time, when my first book had come out and I was being massacred across in every conceivable magazine, media, in India, etc., but not internationally, because they saw something which a lot of my colleagues at that time didn't. And we all must remember that the worst, the nastiest criticism always comes from your contemporaries. It's never the young, because they have a much more open mind. It's never the people who are much older than you, because you're no competition, they've already done what they had to do. It's always people, your own age group, who can't handle it if you're successful. So I didn't know that at that point. So one of the early criticisms was by a person who wrote in India Today, gave me 5 pages in India Today, which at that time was a huge thing. And the title of his criticism was, "Her looks sell her books." Okay, today I'll say I'll take it, At that time, I couldn't take it. I definitely felt, I felt, how dare he? Because the whole piece had nothing to do with the book. It was talking about my clothes, my appearance, my hair. I started off as a model. I know that Lisa has faced exactly the same thing, because we talked about it backstage today. It's all about, your persona, your personal choices, your personal life. But I did not respond, because I did not want to give that guy the kid get out of me immediately writing something to the editor or talking about it on public, channels or anything. But like I'd read Hermann Hesse when I was a very young girl, and in Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse said, if you can starve, if you think, and if you can wait. Starve, think, wait. You'll always be on top.
Wow.
So, I didn't starve, but I did think, and I did wait. Many years later, he wrote his first book and came to me for review. I didn't have to say very much. I just said, what a pity his looks won't sell his book.
Wow. I think that's a great way to conclude a conversation with the unflappable, the lovely. I think we just love her. The way she is, the way she's written, the way she's changed public opinion of women, I think a lot. I think I'm a fan. I've been a fan from a very long time. Yes, we do. We do.